Dr. Nick Smith.
It's with huge pride that I endorse this budget from Bill English, because if you look at all of the vital signs on which you should judge an economy, it is a budget that's making great progress. Let's go through them. What is the rate of interest rates being faced by New Zealand households and businesses today, and how does that compare with what the previous Labor government left? We have got an interest rate, front ads today in the paper, of 4.9%, the lowest mortgage interest rates since, Mr Speaker, I was in nappies in the 1960s. Mr Speaker, they were 9% when the members opposite left, and that halving in interest rates is making an enormous difference to families and businesses throughout New Zealand. Mr Speaker, let's look at growth rates. How's New Zealand's economic growth rate comparing throughout the world? The budget shows a 3% growth rate. Name me a country, name me an OECD country who's delivered a better, stronger economy under the most trying conditions since the Great Depression. You look at UK, 0.3. You look at France, 0.5. You look at the United States, 1.2. Mr Speaker, there's only one country whose growth rate within the OECD is slightly better than New Zealand's growth rate, and that is Australia. And Mr Speaker, and anybody listening to the budget last week in Australia and our own would know that they would rather be on this side of the Tasman. Mr Speaker, another key issue that you should test economic performance by is the cost of living. It impacts on every New Zealander. You see, members opposite want to highlight the odd element. One minute they were screaming last year, food prices are going out of control. Actually, the Department of Statistics shows that the cost of living in the last year for households has gone up by less than any time in the last 15 years. Any time in the last 15 years. And Mr Andrew Little's interjecting there. What was the inflation rate after Labor had been in government for 9 years? It was over 5%. New Zealand families could feel themselves going backwards. Their power prices were going up, their food prices were going up, the government was spending like there was no tomorrow, and their charges were going up. Look at growth, look at inflation, look at jobs, look at mortgage interest rates, Mr Speaker, and this is an outstanding budget. Now, Mr Speaker, I was interested in Mr Parker's contribution, in which he said that the Labor Party was good at fiscal discipline. Good at fiscal discipline. Well, Mr Speaker, let's look at the numbers. I totaled up how much had Labor spent in new spending in their last 5 budgets. Mr Speaker, in their last 5 budgets, how much had Labor spent? $14 billion of new spending. $14 billion of new spending over their last 5 budgets. And Mr Speaker, I compare that with this budget, Bill English's 5th. What is the total amount of new spending in each of those 5 budgets? If we take the zero budgets when times were really tough, a total of $3 billion of new spending. Am I going to take a lecture in fiscal discipline from David Parker when the record shows that the last Labor government spent like there was no tomorrow, left a huge wave, a decade of deficits, of which Bill English has been beavering away out year in, year out, and is now going to balance the books? And Mr Speaker, I want to focus in on that question. How many OECD countries have been able to deliver a budget in which they're going to balance the books? How many? How many, Mr Speaker? Well, actually, there were 2. There was New Zealand and there was Australia. Except Australia delivered a budget with their hopeless Labor Party, where they had to declare a deficit of $20 billion. Mr Speaker, we know the UK has been in tough times. Actually, their deficit in the UK is bigger than the whole New Zealand economy. Bigger than the whole New Zealand economy. Now, Mr Speaker, I looked up the speeches from last year's budget. There was ridicule from members opposite that Bill English would be able to balance the books. They said it was a joke. They said he would never get there. You had all those speeches criticising his fiscal approach. Mr Speaker, Bill English has delivered the goods and delivered them better than any other OECD country. But, Mr Speaker, I want to go further in saying absolutely Bill English and John Key are sticking to a plan. Despite all of the rhetoric from members opposite, let's go through the things they said they would do and how they've delivered. We've got the mixed ownership model. Yes, there's been a few headwinds. Yes, the opposition has disgracefully done their best to sabotage the interests of New Zealand taxpayers in opposing that policy. But, Mr Speaker, we've seen it through, we've seen a successful float of Mighty River Power, and one thing we understand on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, that members opposite do not. A strong share market is absolutely crucial to a successful economy. Can members opposite, who want to sabotage our stock market, who want to sabotage it, tell me a successful economy that doesn't have a successful stock market? The silence is deafening. You see, we on this side of the House understand what's needed for a strong economy and what's to deliver goods for New Zealanders. But, Mr Speaker, I also want to tell the story of this budget in that it does deal with the real issues facing New Zealand. Mr Speaker, I particularly want to talk about the initiatives in this budget on housing. Now, Mr Speaker, I do want to draw a contrast. I listened carefully to Mr Parker saying that house price inflation under this government has been awful. So I went to the Parliamentary Library and I asked them for the figures. What was the average increase in house price from 2000 to 2008? And the answer was an average of 9% per year. 9% per year was what house prices went up by, Mr Little, when you were President of the Labour Party and Labour was in government. And, Mr Speaker, what's the average over the last 5 years? 9% under Labour. What's the average over the last 5 years been? 2.1%. 2.1% has been the average increase over the last 5 years. But, Mr Speaker, it is openly acknowledged that particularly in the last year, house prices have moved. So the budget has responded. Now, the interesting feature is this, Mr Speaker. The Productivity Commission, an initiative that we had with the ACT Party, produced a comprehensive report on what was needed to be done around improving house prices for New Zealanders. They said we had to address land supply, that we had to address infrastructure costs, that we had to address the issues of materials costs, of productivity in the sector, particularly in the area of skills, Mr Speaker, and we had to deal with the compliance costs. And over the last month, you've seen the government on every one of those 5 areas announcing initiatives in each of those things. And I compare that, Mr Speaker, with members opposite. Members opposite have opposed this government on every attempt to fix the RMA roadblocks to getting affordable houses for ordinary New Zealanders. Every single step. And, Mr Speaker, we then hear the response to Labour. Isn't it interesting? Well, if houses aren't affordable, the answer is for, the government to run it, the government to do it. Well, they've got the same approach with the electricity sector, Mr Speaker. They say, the way to get good power prices is for the government to run it. Well, I'm just waiting for the next Labour member to say to us that to get better food prices, all we've got to do is get the government to buy all the damn supermarkets. Mr Speaker, it's a lunatic policy. It's a policy that is a huge risk to the future of the economy, and we should not have a bar of it. Mr Speaker, the other thing I want to compliment the Minister of Finance on is the smart spending. Careful spending, but smart spending in this budget. Every member of this House knows that we need to grow our exports and our foreign exchange earnings. And that's why it commits $400 million, increased tourism, increased support for our exporters, increased investments in technology, increased investments in areas like skills and apprenticeships, things that will make a difference. The last point I want to make, Mr Speaker, is in every single area in which the New Zealand economy has opportunities for growth and jobs, members opposite, particularly with this mixed ownership business between Labour and the Greens, say no. They say no to the convention centre. Right now, Mr Speaker, there's an issue in my area with the industry of aquaculture, where we've got the Green Party opposing any growth of that industry and jobs for my constituents. We've got the issue of Denniston mining, where, look, you've had more positions than the Kama Sutra from the Labour Party on whether they support or whether they oppose that. Whether it comes to irrigation, where does the Labour Party stand on the growth in irrigation? I've heard Mr Parker say they're totally opposed. Mr Speaker, this is a good budget. This is a budget about growth. This is a budget that will give New Zealanders confidence about their future and we're in better shape than any other country in the world, and by goodness, Mr Speaker, we should be proud and pass this budget.
Mr Speaker.
I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.